A lot of the work we've been doing in Haida Gwaii, Hecate Strait areas focused on the ancient shorelines, and the history of these shorelines is quite complex. Initially, work done by people like Knut Fladmark, John Clague, Calvin Heusser in the 60s and 70s provided sort of the inkling of evidence that sea levels were very high, maybe between 8 and 5,000 years ago, and much lower as you go back in time, before 9 or 10,000 years ago. So we've, of course, are very interested in shorelines. If you're working on the northwest coast, most of the activity, most of the food is at that interface between land and sea, and certainly that's where most of the major habitations were. So archaeologists very often try to look for sites on that shore. And in our case, we know that that shore was a moving target, and we have to use environmental modeling, landscape reconstruction, to find out where the ancient shores were in order to then be able to look for the archaeological sites and then interpret them once we do find them. In this case, we did quite a bit of work looking at ponds and different basins, whether they're onshore or offshore, and looking at the microfossils, little plant and animal remains that are present in the sediments of lakes and ponds, and then picking out the change in elevation, sort of in time, in which there's a shift from fresh water to salt water, for example, at a pond or a lake. And by using these points and dating them, we're able to produce a very detailed history of the changes in sea level over the last 14 or 15,000 years. And then once we had that, we selected areas to do remote sensing on, that is, prepare models of the seafloor, for example, or of areas on land that would have perhaps been at the shore at a different period in time. And through those, we're able to pick up river channels, terraces, lakes, a whole variety of features that are now, for example, drowned beneath 100 or 150 meters of ocean water. And with that in hand, we went off working with the Geological Survey of Canada, for example, and the Canadian Hydrographic Service, working offshore, trying to find evidence of these ancient landscapes, and we're quite successful. And at other times we worked on land, working with archaeologists, Haida people, for example, looking at the raised beaches where some of these old shorelines are now back in the rainforest. So sort of had to look at all different parts of the landscape, both on land and in sea, to follow that elusive shoreline and then try to find the evidence of people being on that shoreline.